Dragon's Dogma 2 shattered expectations. Over the last few years, AAA games have been a bit of a mixed bag. We really don't know what we're going to get, especially on day one. But Dragon's Dogma 2 is my most anticipated game of this year, so believe me when I say that I was the prime candidate to be wowed, impressed, upset, disappointed, confused, the whole spectrum, you name it. Today what I want to do is I want to talk about my journey through Dragon's Dogma 2, but I want to contrast that and compare that with our expectations for AAA games and what we really can expect from them moving forward. Dragon's Dogma 2 is far from a bad game. It's incredible. But it really does go to show that even the greatest things can lose their luster in the face of corporate greed and poor decisions. In my videos leading up to the release of Dragon's Dogma 2, I discussed game director Hideki Itsuno's vision for the game, as it was a major talking point of his interviews. I've watched as it's turned into a meme more than anything else, where players are justly voicing their grievances in contrast with Itsuno's vision. Whether it's the story, the exploration, the missing spells and abilities not carried over from the first game, the lack of enemy variety, you name it, while I widely agree with many of the criticisms on the game, I do believe that Itsuno's vision is realized, albeit within the confines of his ability, his team's ability, creating an open world game, and the realities of AAA development. Rarely do games live up to our expectations, and I think even Elden Ring is a great example of that. A game that is still one of my favorite games, likely one of the greatest games in the last decade. However, even it suffered from repetitive elements, performance issues, and drawbacks of open world design. Now, while I think Miyazaki's vision is much more visible in Elden Ring, Itsuno's vision is viewed in the finer details. The combat in Dragon's Dogma 2 is incredible. While the movement and climbing still feels as janky as the first game, the moment-to-moment gameplay gives you the feeling of being an overpowered monster that lays waste to all that stand before them. I played as fighter, archer, thief, and warrior, really only leveling the other three to make sure that my warrior build could really shine. Even after playing Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, I was stunned to just see how vastly different each vocation played and how satisfying their playstyles could be. Timing parries with the fighter, smoke bomb backstabbing with the thief, shooting a griffin out of the sky as an archer, and knocking out a cyclops with a well-timed strike as a warrior. Each vocation allows you to play out a power fantasy to its fullest. And for me, that was the warrior. I loved playing the warrior. The warrior felt heavy, it looked heavy, it played heavy. You're not fleet of foot, but your passives allow you to be able to just shrug off enemy attacks like they didn't even hit you. My attacks felt like I was dropping a mountain on top of my enemies, each strike shattering the ground, sending enemies flying or making large enemies stumble back from the sheer force of my attacks. Using timed shoulder charges to grant myself immunity from heavy enemy strikes, hammering enemies' weak spots for more than half of their health. It just felt right, it looked right, and it was the same way for every vocation that I played. Over the years, it's felt like action RPGs have just gotten more and more carried away with over-the-top combat, reaching harder into fantasy rather than reality. And while I can still appreciate those games, and Dragon's Dogma 2 definitely has its moments, there is just something incredibly engaging about combat that seems to follow common logic and reasoning. I've always been a fan of Lord of the Rings, extended edition by the way, don't bother trying to watch anything else. Berserk. Obviously, Dungeons & Dragons, and Dragon's Dogma 2 delivers on that fantasy in a way that very few games do. And I just keep looping back to this word heavy, weighted, because that's really what the game feels like. The movement looks like it, the attacks look like it, the world itself feels heavy, and because of that, it kind of feels a bit more tangible than other games that we play. And I've seen a lot of people that have been complaining about monster density. There's too many monsters that they see in the world, and too many of the exact same monsters that we'll see in the world, which, by the way, we'll talk about that later. But if it wasn't for how great the combat feels, then this game would get old relatively quickly. But at the end of the day, it's an action RPG. It's all about the gameplay, and the gameplay is the combat. And because the combat is so good, the game already gets high remarks. And whether it's sending a goblin flying, knocking a human across into a wall, slamming down and knocking back an ogre or a griffin with one well-timed strike, it never gets old and it always feels good. And to be honest with you, exploring the world feels the same way. Now, when I'm saying exploring the world, I'm talking about visiting it for the first time or revisiting an area that isn't your primary objective. Both Vermund and Batal have a cinematic presence that isn't really found in many games. I often found myself not wanting to use fairy stones, ox carts, or run during different times of exploration because I genuinely enjoyed the feeling of being in this game's world. I would sit at camp with my pawns. I would take slow walks down paths looking for secrets and other things that I may have missed, or would slow pan the camera across vistas, just taking in the sights. Oftentimes, I would turn off the HUD because for me, it felt like this was the real way to consume the game, the way that you were meant to actually see it. No map, no direction, no context, no nothing, just you in the world with only the sun to guide your path. The world is peppered with small towns, houses, outposts, ruins, caves, and hideaways, all holding secrets for those who take the time to explore. There is a lot of meaningful and purposeful design in the world of Dragon's Dogma 2, and it's something that I greatly appreciate because for me, it's one of the biggest drawbacks of open world games is the repetition that tends to plague them. Copy and pasted dungeons, towers, fast travel points, enemy camps, and more that only really serve to create busy work for the players and fluff the hours spent in the game just to justify the price that we spent on it and for them to be able to cut costs on development. I never really felt like I saw the same thing twice outside of enemies and the common side quest of an NPC needing to be rescued or escorted. However, for me, much of this repetition felt like it was localized, and because of that, it made a lot more sense. I see totems or crude outposts and poles. Well, I know this is a goblin-controlled territory, and I will likely see many of them. I see an abandoned village, and it's likely to be filled with bandits. Saurians are always found near water, harpies around cliffs and rock formations, golems near ruins, and griffins will likely show up if I stand around livestock that's grazing. Similar to the combat, I appreciate the common reasoning that's used in the world because it helps it not feel repetitive, but just instead makes sense. I recognize that this sort of design isn't for everyone. No game can be made for everyone. But logically, the game makes sense to me, and it really only enhanced my overall immersion. Now, this isn't to say that I didn't find exploration lacking at times, or I didn't see where they were saving time and budget. I remember early into my playthrough, I stumbled into this huge dungeon that was filled with enemies and loot. I fought a chimera, an ogre, opened up a chest at the end that spawned a wight. I loved it. 3 bosses in one dungeon. Took me almost 30 minutes to complete the entire thing. I loved every second of it, and I started wondering just how deep that dungeon could go while I was in there and couldn't wait to stumble onto the next one, as it's very much something that I want in highly explorable RPGs like Dragon's Dogma. We love dungeons. RPG lovers love dungeons. It's kind of goes hand in hand with the entire genre. However, after 80 hours of play searching every corner of the world, I never found another place like it. Most caves were short, lacking any large fights or enemy bosses or anything like that, and at most it would contain minor chests and some mineable nodes. Now, this didn't ruin my experience. I think that's something that's really important to remember, is that I still did that dungeon. I still had a lot of fun doing it, but realizing that it was the only one out of the entire game still felt like a bit of a letdown. Now, without containing any spoilers, questing and main quests didn't really continue to facilitate my feeling of immersion while I was exploring the world for the first time. They felt more like distractions rather than anything of substance, and it makes me feel as though Capcom in general is better at telling over-the-top stories like Devil May Cry and the Resident Evil series. Now, I will say not all quests are created equal. It's obvious that a lot of effort went into the Sphinx quest, arguably one of the best quests, if not the best quest in the entire game. And also, while not the best designed quest, I did really enjoy the story of the dwarf and elf couple that were living on the outskirts of town, ridiculed by others, but doting on one another. As a player, I don't really have much of an issue with these stories that are told, but as much as the quests that were given. Stealth quests in a game that doesn't have any stealth mechanics, time quests with no direction, and an absurd amount of fetch quests. And some of the quests felt as though they just ended abruptly without any actual closure. I typically don't play games for the story, but that's not to say that I can't play a game for a story. It's all about how that story is told and also how it's delivered upon in quest design. And I think Baldur's Gate 3 probably did the best version of this possible for an RPG because they gave the player so much autonomy to be able to choose how they want to, solve some of these quest issues. And because of their choices, it would give them unique rewards, it would give them unique story beats, and it made it more of an experience rather than just checking off different tasks for the sake of progress more than anything else. And I think this is where Dragon's Dogma 2 really dropped the ball, because there are some of those quests that do have sometimes a unique story beat or something like that, but many of the quests give you the feigned idea that if you do it a certain way that you're going to get some type of different experience because of the choices that you make, but in most times it really doesn't result in much of anything. I think a really good example of this is a quest that I took on to help a sculptor sketch a griffin. And he tells you of this ancient tale where a great warrior used a Medusa head to freeze a griffin in place. So I was like, wow, I remember fighting one of those. I'm going to go kill the Medusa, grab its head, and then use it, and then see, what ends up happening. Nothing. I just got more gold, apparently. And it was one of those moments where you just sat back and say, oh, this isn't one of those games. And I'll be honest with you, there were a lot of moments like that for me, especially when it came to later game exploration, traveling, and bosses. While I definitely enjoyed traveling the world, I do think that Dragon's Dogma 2 is an absolutely gorgeous game. I felt the repetition slowly take hold around 50 hours in, and if it weren't for the combat and me frequently switching vocations, I likely would have felt it a lot sooner. In the interviews leading up to the release of Dragon's Dogma 2, on a few occasions, Itsuno raised mine and many other players' expectations when it came to enemy variety and unique elements in the game. I think the best example of this was his IGN interviews, where he was speaking about the Finks and said that we made a lot that players don't necessarily need to find, but will be incredibly moved if they do find it. However, I can't personally speak to anything that is similar to this Finks, and I think that it was just AAA promotional speak more than anything else. When it comes to enemy boss types, we have the Cyclops, Golem, Armored Cyclops, Ogres, Spiked Ogre, Griffin, Minotaur, Armored Minotaur, Medusa, Lich, Dullahan, and Dragons. With the Medusa, Lich, and Dullahan only seen a couple times, or maybe even just once. Ogres and Cyclops are seen more frequently, and again, I feel as though the combat is carrying the game and not the diversity of the experience that we could be having. Which is someone that spent a lot of time playing Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, this feels like a major step back when comparing the two games, as we've seemingly lost so many different enemies that we once had. The lack of variety really bears its fangs in the middle of the game when you're likely close to moving towards the end of the game. However, you're trying to tie up loose ends, finish some quests, and level up some vocations before barreling towards the finish line. What felt like emergent gameplay now starts to become easy to predict. You're no longer struggling to fight enemies in your way, and you just cut through them like butter, or just ignore them entirely, attempting to drag your pawns with you. There is some novelty in the random monster attacks on ox carts and campsites. However, the novelty quickly wears off, and you just say, oh, it's wolves again. Oh, it's goblins again. Oh, it's a griffin. Aren't we feeling spicy? Now, personally, I don't think this is something that is an indictment on Dragon's Dogma 2 as much as it is an open-world game design. A lot of resources, time, money, and effort go into carefully designing a world. The bigger that world is, the more likely you are to see some elements repeated, because they're using it as a means to be able to save cost or time savings, but also because you have already played the game for 30 or more hours. The longer you're in a game's world, the more familiar you're going to become with it, and the harder it is for the game to be able to surprise you. From my perspective, the only reason the game feels tedious or repetitive at times is due to the scarcity of surprise in other elements of the game. With quest design lacking, meaningful boss fights scarce to be found, and travel incredibly limited in the early to mid-game, the focus of the player is placed squarely on combat and exploration, where combat holds its own, but exploration will ultimately suffer from open world woes. I had astronomically high expectations for Dragon's Dogma 2, and largely the game met me on them, but that's because I chose to meet the game halfway. I came back down to reality a little bit, because we oftentimes will hype games to the moon with little to no context of what the game is actually going to be like when that game is released. I think MMOs are an incredible example of this. We will love them, and they are the most popular before they ever even exist. And it's likely when we know the least about the game is when the game is more popular, and the more transparent the developers are, the more we start to walk away from them more than anything else. I've found that over the years, the games that I have the least amount of context on are some of the games that end up being my best experiences of all time. I think Terraria is probably my best example of that, because I knew nothing of the game. I didn't know anything about its success or anything like that. just a friend told me, hey, you should play this, you would probably like it. And I had my world flipped upside down multiple times because I went in with zero expectations to a game that was absolutely fantastic, a record-setting game more than anything else. And I think the thing that's frustrating is that our expectations, my expectations at the very least, were supported by a lot of the interviews, especially all the IGN stuff, IGN's coverage, as well as a lot of Itsuno's words. So I felt justified in the expectations that I had going into Dragon's Dogma 2. However, at the exact same time, our imagination is far more powerful than what developers can realistically come up with, at least for the most part. In some ways, I think that a lot of the smaller studios, independent studios, do have the means to be able to deliver upon those things, because even though we have lower expectations for them, they have a lower chance of success to get their game noticed unless they're specifically delivering on what we need and what we want. And that's what's really important to them, but it's not really as important to these AAA studios. So that's why our expectations can oftentimes not be met. But that doesn't mean that Dragon's Dogma 2 shouldn't have delivered on some of those expectations the way that they should have. As game prices continue to soar, especially those with a lack of regional pricing, I mean, there are some games that are released and priced over the average monthly salary of a country's residents. Our expectations for those games rightfully soar with it. As consumers, we often equate price to quality, and I think that's starting to cause a significant amount of dissonance between many of the people that are purchasing these AAA games, as well as Dragon's Dogma 2. Console players, PC players, everyone was and still is having issues with the game's performance, frame rate, and crashing. This has become common practice with publicly traded AAA studios and publishers because optimization is not a priority. Customer satisfaction is not a priority. Shareholders' interests are. Capcom stock soared up 40% at the start of the year just before the release of Dragon's Dogma 2, where eventually the investors sold off before the fiscal year closed. It's about money. It's about getting the game out the door, especially when they can just apologize and fix the game later. I think that Itsuno's vision was realized within the confines of what a director or developer can do under the pressures of a AAA development cycle and the copy-pasted instructions that these companies use to maximize their profits while cutting costs wherever they can. Well, I'm not going to discuss the end game in depth because I don't want this video to contain any major spoilers. For me, it was both very cool and very underwhelming at the same time when we compare it to something like the Everfall, the Seneschal, or the Bitter Black Isle expansion that came with Dragon's Dogma 2 Dark Arisen. And that likely isn't a design choice, but a programmed response to ensure that they have more content to add for more money later. Many studios on launch don't make games that are infinitely replayable anymore because, well, that's only reserved for live service games and future DLC. Many games are developed with the first 30 to 50 hours in mind because that's likely where reviewers are going to stop playing and where the average player taps out, which makes both investors and those who are running these companies view end-game content in single-player games as an unnecessary cost or something to be sold later. The trend of prioritizing short-term financial gains over the quality and completeness of a game at launch is not only disheartening, but it undermines the craft and the art of actual game development. The practice of shipping now and fixing later shifts the burden from the developers to the consumers, who are then forced to either wait for patches to address their issues or to deal with a subpar experience and play the game as is. Furthermore, this approach has also a chilling effect on the creative expression of the developers, who may have very ambitious ideas for their projects but are constrained by corporate mandates focused on profitability. The resulting games, while potentially lucrative in the short term, like Dragon's Dogma 2 as an example, can damage the studio's reputation and erode the trust among the fan base. Roughly, in the words of the late and great Total Biscuit, buying a game day one or pre-ordering is you buying the worst version of the game at the highest price. If we set expectations aside, Dragon's Dogma 2's failings are only those of the industry that made it, not the game itself. Dragon's Dogma 2 is an incredible game, an absolutely fantastic game, but it does go to show just how punishing the poor decisions of money grubbers more than anything else have on some of these games, how that corporate greed can ruin an otherwise great game. And it hasn't really ruined this game, but it does go to show just how great a game they can make and how they can still just keep it from absolute greatness or perfection through, well, their own means of incompetence more than anything else. And I just looked into it recently and found out that this game has like 1/4 of the amount of people in the credits than any other game that they've put out recently, meaning that this game likely had far less budget, far less people, far less time to be able to make, and they were still able to pull off what they did, which is impressive, but it goes to show that they have no no faith in this IP whatsoever, but they were also trying to cost cut as much as they possibly could to maximize whatever they could get out of Dragon's Dogma 2. And that sucks, man. It's disgusting because it's such a great game and it could have been even better. It could have been the ultimate game if they would have just given it the chance, but, well, that's just not what investors want, and that's not what the management of these companies want. It immediately makes me start thinking to GDC 2024 with Sven Vinke going up on stage and saying, just slow down with the greed, seeing these companies make the same mistakes over and over again. And when I look and I see their stock price and how their stock price took a tank right after the release of Dragon's Dogma 2, I'm wondering if part of that was the sell-off before the end of the fiscal year, but also combined with the fact that the game had a lot of negative press because of the performance issues and a lot of the backlash from players. And all of that stuff could be avoided. I think that's what's the most frustrating thing about this game, is that with all of that other part of the conversation out of it, it's still a great game, and all of these issues could have been avoided. Instead, it's sitting tarred and feathered still on Steam, mixed reviews because of de novo and microtransactions, which I agree with those criticisms of the game, but I still feel like it distracts from the overall conversation that we should be having about this game, which is wasted money that they used and also money that they didn't invest into the right places to begin with. If they didn't spend the money on de novo, most people probably wouldn't even have pirated this game or tried to pirate it to begin with. Most people were going to buy this game. That's money that you could have invested into the game to give them more time for optimization or for more dungeons, please, more dungeons, or for a better end game or something like that. But that didn't happen here, and it doesn't happen in games anymore because that's just what the AAA industry does. That's what the top end of this industry is anymore. They just don't have the ability to do those things to meet our expectations on the high end, not the same way that independent studios, single A games, and indie games can, because, well, those guys survive by meeting our expectations. That's the only way for those companies to find recognition, is by meeting our expectations. These companies don't need to because they appeal to a broader market, and yeah, our expectations don't mean anything to them. Our satisfaction doesn't mean anything to them. It sucks, but it is what it is. I love Dragon's Dogma 2. I think it's an absolutely fantastic game, and I hate to say that it's going to be improved by DLC, but that's just the industry and the reality of the world that we live in. I'm not going to suggest this game to anybody and say, oh, you should buy it right now, because Capcom games go on sale relatively quickly, and you're going to end up buying a cheaper version and a better version of the game than the people that bought it at launch or pre-ordered it. So obviously that's the smarter choice to make. So yeah, though I love this game and I think it's absolutely fantastic and it has its fair share of headaches, there are so many things here that could have been completely avoided, and I wish they did. But that's all I got for today. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did enjoy this video, think about subscribing to the channel. Follow me on Twitch. I stream a couple times a week. I'm probably going to slow down on my streaming a little bit to try to make more videos instead, because now that I'm doing this full time, I'm kind of coming to the realization that I need to grow YouTube more than try to stream. It's a really odd balance to try to hit when you're making content like this, and I don't really do like React content and stuff like that to be able to, you know, stem the tide a little bit. But yeah. Anyway, I hope you guys dig this video. That's all I got for today. Stay cool, stay righteous, stay safe. Have an absolute fantastic week, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.
Family, 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 family.